So my girlfriend and I were spending a quiet evening together in my room, basking in each other's company. So we'd been dating for almost a year, and though our relationship had its fair share of ups and downs, I was in love with her. She had this way of making everything feel right, even when things were off kilter. The room was dimly lit, casting soft shadows across the walls. We were watching a movie, but it was clear neither of us were particularly focused on it. Instead, we were more involved with each other, lost in our own little world. The silence between us was comfortable, punctuated by occasional laughs or playful teasing. It was one of those perfect moments when everything felt in sync. But then came the knock. I froze, my heart racing in my chest. My father never knocked. He wasn't the type to care much about personal space, especially mine. His heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway, and I felt a sinking feeling in my stomach. Before I could say anything, the door swung open. There stood my father, his face a mask of surprise that quickly morphed into anger. I could feel the tension in the room skyrocket as my girlfriend and I scrambled to compose ourselves. "What's going on in here?" His voice was harsh, demanding an explanation, though I was sure he already knew the answer. I stammered, trying to form a coherent response, but the words just wouldn't come out. My girlfriend sat beside me, equally shocked and embarrassed. I could see the redness creeping up her cheeks as she avoided looking at my father. It was as if the walls had started closing in, the room suddenly too small to contain the whirlwind of emotions that had erupted. My father's eyes darted between us, his face growing harder with each passing second. "You know better than this," he finally said, his voice low but filled with an underlying fury that scared me more than if he'd been shouting. In that moment, I felt like a child again, being scolded for something small. But this wasn't small. I could see the disappointment etched on his face, and that hurt more than anything else. I had always been close to my father, looked up to him in many ways, and now I felt like I had let him down in the worst possible way. My girlfriend stood up, muttering something about leaving, but my father's sharp gaze stopped Tej and blocked her in her tracks. "You're not going anywhere," he said sternly. "We need to have a talk." My stomach churned. I wanted to get out of there to escape the suffocating air of the room, but I knew that wasn't an option. My father was going to make me face this, whether I liked it or not. As my girlfriend slowly sat back down, my father crossed his arms over his chest, staring me down. "How long has this been going on?" he asked, his tone accusatory. I could feel the weight of his gaze on me as I tried to gather my thoughts. It wasn't like we'd been sneaking around behind his back, but in that moment it sure felt like it. It's not what it looks like," I tried to say, but the words felt hollow, even to me. "Not what it looks like." My father's voice was incredulous, filled with disbelief. "Then explain it to me, because from where I'm standing, it looks pretty damn obvious." I swallowed hard, glancing over at my girlfriend, who was still avoiding eye contact with both of us. I wanted to protect her, to shield her from whatever was coming, but I didn't know how. I was as lost as she was in that moment. "We were just watching a movie," I finally said, though it sounded weak even to my own ears. "A movie," my father repeated, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Right." I knew I was in for it now. There was no way out of this without some serious consequences. I could see it in my father's eyes, the disappointment, the anger, the betrayal. I had crossed a line, and there was no taking it back. He turned his attention to my girlfriend, who finally lifted her head to meet his gaze. "Do your parents know where you are?" he asked, his tone sharp. She shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper when she spoke. "No, sir." My father's jaw tightened, and I could see the gears turning in his head. He wasn't just angry at me, he was angry at the situation, at the fact that he felt like he had been blindsided by something he should have seen coming. "You need to leave," he said finally, his voice cold. My girlfriend looked at me, her eyes filled with uncertainty. I could see the hurt in her expression, and it tore me apart. I wanted to tell her to stay, to stand up to my father, but I knew that would only make things worse. So I nodded, giving her the permission she didn't need but clearly wanted. As she gathered her things and quietly slipped out of the room, I was left alone with my father. The silence was deafening, the tension palpable. I could feel the weight of his disappointment pressing down on me, suffocating me. After what felt like an eternity, he finally spoke. "I thought I raised you better than this," he said quietly, but the pain in his voice was unmistakable. I wanted to defend myself, to explain that it wasn't what he thought it was, but the truth was, I didn't even know how to begin. I had messed up, and there was no denying that. "I'm sorry," I said, though I knew it wasn't enough. It wouldn't fix what had just happened, wouldn't erase the look of betrayal on his face. "Sorry isn't going to cut it," he said, his voice growing colder. "You need to take a long, hard look at yourself and figure out what kind of person you think be. 'Cause right now you're heading down a path I don't even recognize." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I had always prided myself on being a good son, on making my parents proud, but now, standing there in front of him, I felt like I had failed in every way possible. As he turned and walked out of the room, leaving me alone with my thoughts, I couldn't help but feel like I had just lost something important, not just my father's respect, but a part of myself as well. I sat down on the edge of my bed, staring blankly at the wall, trying to process everything that had just happened. The weight of the situation settled over me like a heavy blanket, suffocating me with guilt and regret. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more content like this. And if you have any thoughts or opinions on what just happened, feel free to share them in the comment section below. A few days passed, but the tension in the house didn't lift. My father and I barely spoke. Every time I tried to bring up the incident or apologize, he would brush me off with a curt response, as if he couldn't even stand to look at me. I was spiraling, feeling more and more distant from him and from myself. I began to question everything: my relationship, my choices, and even my own character. Had I really changed that much? Or had I always been this person, and it just took this moment for my father to see it? My girlfriend was supportive, but even she was beginning to pull away. The awkwardness of the situation, combined with the cold reception she had gotten from my father, was straining our relationship. We tried to act like everything was normal, but the truth was, nothing felt normal anymore. So one night, as I lay awake in bed, unable to sleep, I found myself scrolling through Reddit. I wasn't even sure what I was looking for, maybe some sort of validation, some reassurance that I wasn't the worst port in the world. But instead, I stumbled upon a thread about betrayal and cheating. The stories were hauntingly similar to mine. People talking about the moments when they had crossed a line, the guilt they felt, and the devastating consequences that followed. The more I read, the more I realized that I had betrayed not just my father, but myself as well. I hadn't cheated, but in a way, it felt like I had. I had broken the trust my father had in me, had put my relationship with my girlfriend above everything else, and now I was paying the price for it. The comments on the Reddit thread were brutal. People talking about how once trust is broken, it's almost impossible to rebuild. How relationships, whether with a parent or a partner, are fragile things that can be shattered in an instant. And how, once that trust is gone, it's often too late to fix it. I didn't want to believe that. I didn't want to accept that I had lost something I could never get back. But deep down, I knew there was some truth to it. The days turned into weeks, and the distance between my father and me only grew. My girlfriend and I tried to hold on, but the weight of everything that had happened was too much for us to bear. Eventually, we broke up. It wasn't an angry breakup, it was more like we had simply drifted apart, pulled in different directions by the gravity of our own lives. As for my father, things didn't get better overnight. It took a long time, months, even for us to start rebuilding the relationship we once had. It was a slow process filled with awkward conversations and moments of frustration. But eventually, we found our way back to each other. It wasn't the same as before, but it was something. Looking back, I realize now that that night was a turning point in my life. It forced me to confront some hard truths about myself and the people I cared about. It made me understand the importance of trust and respect, not just in relationships but in life as a whole. If you like this story, comment your opinion in the comment section below. As the months dragged on, the wound between my father and I began to scab over. But it was clear that the scar would never fully heal. The silence between us had become the norm, our conversations reduced to short, formal exchanges that felt more like we were co-workers than family. He still couldn't look at me the same way. I could see it in his eyes whenever we crossed paths in the house. The disappointment lingered, hovering over us like a storm cloud that just wouldn't pass. But one day, out of the blue, he invited me to go fishing with him. It was something we used to do when I was a kid, long before I ever started dating or worrying about relationships. Back then, it was our thing, just the two of us on the lake, casting lines, barely talking but never needing to. When he asked, I almost said no. The tension between us still felt too raw, and I didn't know if I was ready to face whatever conversation we might have out there, alone in a boat. But something in his voice, the way he asked, made me think that maybe this was his way of extending an olive branch. So I agreed. The drive to the lake was quiet, filled with the hum of the car and the occasional comment about the weather or the state of the road. It wasn't uncomfortable, but it wasn't exactly comfortable either. I kept stealing glances at him, wondering if this was the moment he was going to bring up what happened. But he didn't. He just focused on the road, his hands gripping the wheel tightly. When we got to the lake, we unloaded the gear in silence, the routine of setting up the boat familiar and oddly calming. For a moment, it felt like things might actually be normal again, like we were slipping back into the father-son dynamic we had before everything got so complicated. We rowed out to the middle of the lake, the stillness of the water reflecting the blue sky above. The only sounds were the gentle splash of the oars and the occasional chirp of birds in the distance. Once we reached our usual spot, we cast our lines and settled into the quiet. I expected the conversation to come soon, to start heavy and awkward like it always did these days. But instead, he just sat there staring out at the water, as if nothing was wrong. Minutes turned into an hour, and still he didn't say anything. Finally, unable to take the silence anymore, I spoke up. Dad, I know things haven't been right between us, and I get it. I messed up. He cut me off, his voice soft but firm. You don't need to explain it again. I fell silent, unsure of what to say. He wasn't angry, but there was something in his tone that told me he'd already made his peace with what had happened, even if I hadn't. We all make mistakes, he said after a long pause. Some bigger than others, but that's part of life. What matters is what you do after. I swallowed, trying to absorb his words. There was no judgment in his voice, no accusation, just the weight of experience of someone who had lived through more than I could ever understand. I know you're not the same kid you used to be, he continued, casting his line back into the water. You've grown up, and with that comes mistakes. I was your age once. I made my fair share. This was the most he had ever spoken about his own past. My father was never one to open up about his personal life, especially not about anything that resembled failure. It made me realize just how much this moment meant to him, and to me. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded, letting his words sink in. The conversation drifted into silence again, but it felt different this time. It wasn't the tense, uncomfortable silence that had followed us around for the past few months. It was peaceful, like finally found some common ground. Eventually, he spoke again. Your mother and I, we didn't have it easy when we first got together. There were times when I thought it was over, times when I wasn't sure if we'd make it. He paused, and I could tell he was choosing his words carefully. But we stuck it out. We learned how to rebuild trust. I looked at him, surprised. He had never spoken about any troubles between him and my mom before. To me, they had always seemed solid, unshakable. But now, hearing him talk about it, I realized that maybe they weren't always perfect. Maybe no one was. What I'm trying to say is, he continued, you're not a bad person because of what happened, but you need to figure out what you want and who you want to be. If you keep running from your mistakes, you're only going to make things harder for yourself. I nodded again, not trusting myself to speak. I could feel the lump in my throat growing, the emotions I'd been holding back for so long threatening to spill over. But I didn't want to break down in front of him, not now. Not when we were finally talking like this. So we stayed out on the lake for a few more hours, fishing in near silence, the conversation drifting to lighter topics, weather. But beneath it all, I knew something had shifted. We weren't back to normal. Not yet, but we were getting there. As we rowed back to shore, I felt a strange sense of relief wash over me. It wasn't that everything was fixed or forgiven, but it felt like a new beginning, like maybe, just maybe, we could find a way to move forward. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about the conversation on the lake. My father had opened up to me in a way he never had before, and it made me realize just how much I had been holding back, how much I had been afraid to confront my own mistakes, my own flaws. The next few weeks passed in a blur. I focused on rebuilding my relationship with my father, doing my best to show him that I was committed to making things right. So it wasn't easy. There were still moments of tension, moments where I could tell he was struggling to fully trust me again, but we were making progress. I also threw myself into work, trying to stay busy, trying to distract myself from the nagging feeling that I had lost something important. My breakup with my girlfriend had hit me harder than I expected, and even though I knew it was for the best, there was still a part of me that missed her. I wondered if things could have been different, if we could have made it work. But deep down, I knew that our relationship had been doomed long before my father had caught us that night. One evening, as I was scrolling through my phone, I saw a notification from Reddit. It was from the same thread I had stumbled upon months ago, the one about betrayal and trust. Someone had commented on my post, sharing their own story of how they had rebuilt trust with a parent after a similar incident. Reading their words, I felt a strange sense of connection, like I wasn't alone in this. And I wasn't the only one who had made mistakes, who had hurt someone they cared about. And maybe, just maybe, that meant there was hope for me too. I decided to reply, sharing a bit of my own story, how my father and I were slowly finding our way back to each other, how I was trying to learn from my mistakes. It wasn't easy to admit, but it felt good to put it out there, to own up to what I had done. As the days went by, I found myself thinking more and more about my father's words on the lake about rebuilding trust and taking responsibility for my actions. It wasn't just about making things right with him, it was about figuring out who I wanted to be. One afternoon, after yet another long day at work, I found myself driving aimlessly around town. Without really thinking about it, I ended up outside my ex-girlfriend's house. It had been months since we last spoke, and I hadn't planned on seeing her again. But something about being there, about standing on the street outside her home, made me realize that I had unfinished business. I didn't know what I was hoping for, or even what I would say. But I knew I needed to talk to her. So I took a deep breath and knocked on her door. To my surprise, she opened it almost immediately, as if she had been expecting me. There was a moment of awkward silence where neither of us knew what to say. But then she smiled, a small, tentative smile that made me feel like maybe things weren't as broken as I thought. "Hey," I said, my voice sounding small in the quiet evening air. "Hey," she replied, stepping aside to let me in. We sat down in her living room, the tension between us palpable but not as suffocating as I had feared. I could feel the weight of everything unsaid pressing down on us, but I didn't know how to begin. "I'm sorry," I blurted out, the words spilling from my mouth before I had a chance to think them through. "For everything. For how things ended. For hurting you." She looked at me for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, slowly, she nodded. "I'm sorry too," she said quietly. "I wasn't fair to you either." We talked for hours that night about our relationship, about the mistakes we had made, about the future. It wasn't a conversation about getting back together, but more about finding closure, about understanding where things had gone wrong and how we could move forward as individuals. When I left her house that night, I felt lighter. It was as if a weight I didn't even realize I had been carrying had been lifted off my shoulders.